Hello everybody, Nick Rains for Kids here once again, and finally I'm able to make another deck profile after so long of absence. I was planning to finish this and upload it a few days earlier, but unfortunately I had a power outage for 3 days due to a giant storm in the area, but thankfully no one was injured by the storm as far as I heard, and especially not myself or anyone that I know. And all that happened was the power was out for a few days. It was a little bit rough, but I'm good now. But besides that, I wanted to share with you guys this fun deck that I've been using lately that does pretty well. I played it recently in the Patreon World Championship qualifier just for fun, and I went 2-2 with it, but I also, to be fair, I played it pretty poorly, and one of those losses I could have possibly won instead, but it was my own fault. My opponent played well, but I also played bad. But I also used this deck as Eliminator for quite a while in the Academy League, and my record for it is 14-6 there. So the deck isn't bad. With that said, let me get into the deck profile itself. I like to call this deck a couple of things. Technically, the name that you would call it is Soul Control Chaos, or Chaos Soul Control, but what I prefer to call it is either Flip, in quotations, Flip Control, because you're playing cards that have flips for their effects, and you also have a couple of flip monsters in the deck. But also, I call this deck Coco Control for the one and only Kaicho in honor of her. If you don't know who that is, that's alright. But if you know, you know. This deck concept came from me not only wanting to play Time Wizard in a deck, but also wanting to see how a Chaos Soul Control deck could go. So let me start with the tribute monsters, because as you can tell, this is a tribute-based deck. Well, of course, it's also a chaos deck, so let me say first, of course, you have BLS and one copy of Sork. We play so many bricks that you don't want to play even more bricks by playing multiple Sorks. To be honest, even one Sork kind of bricks in this deck, but it's good to have something as a special summon. Sometimes I end up siding this out, especially if I know the opponent is playing Kaiku, because I would just rather have less bricky cards in the deck. But besides that, the tribute monsters I have in the deck are 2 Blowback Dragon, which is a Dark level 6, 2300, 1200. 1200 is good because it means it can't be defeated by Tsukiyomi in battle. And its effect is once per turn, you can target one card your opponent controls, which can be a monster or spell or trap, and it could be face up or face down. And you toss a coin 3 times and destroy that target. At least 2 of the results are heads. Something a lot of people get confused about is that they think that this effect is like a 1 in 3 chance of working, but it's actually a 50% chance of working, and they make you flip extra coins for pretty much no reason except to make it look cool. And to be fair, there is a lot of hype every time that you activate this effect, because you're like, oh man, I got 1 heads, oh, I got a tails, am I gonna get another heads? So it's kind of a really fun card in that regard, and with it's a lot better than a Monarch when you revive it, because it's not just a beat stick. You can actually use it as soon as you revive it or throughout subsequent turns. If you want to learn more about the effectiveness of Blowback Dragon, I believe Chris Perovic has a Soul Control discussion video, which I'll link in the description, that talks about the usefulness of Blowback Dragon. It's a card that a lot more people have been playing lately. Then next up, I have 1 copy of Jinzo, which I think everybody knows what it is, but it's a very good card against things like warriors, and it's a dark attribute monster, 2400 attack. It's not quite as good in some cases as another tribute monster that you could play instead, because it doesn't get immediate value when you play it. But against the right deck, it can just basically be an auto win, or again, in the right scenario, it can be an auto win. This is another card that can get sided out a lot if the opponent isn't playing a lot of traps in their deck. But sometimes you leave it in anyway because it's a decent beat stick, although it can be replaced with something on the side that I'll bring up later. Next up, we have a light tribute monster Zaborg, which is level 5, 2400, 1000. When it is tribute summoned, destroy target one monster on the field and destroy it. The reason I don't like to run more than one is because the effect is mandatory. So if I summon it on an empty field, it ends up having to pop itself, and that's just really bad. If this was not mandatory, I probably would play 2 of them in this deck, but as is, when you're already hoping to remove the opponent's monsters because you're playing a control deck, it bricks more often than other tributes, really. But it's light attribute, and sometimes it can come clutch. To round out the tributes, which this deck is relatively light in tribute monsters, I have 3 copies of Thunder Dragon. It's obviously pretty good in chaos decks, and it's a light attribute. You don't want to tribute summon it very often, but there's a lot of scenarios where being a tribute summon is pretty useful, such as with some of the cards that I'll bring up in a little bit, like Brain Control and Soul Exchange. Especially with like Soul Exchange, you can activate Soul Exchange and then tribute set even Thunder Dragon. But essentially you're making use of the +1 from Thunder Dragon's effect by combining it with these cards to get rid of the opponent's monsters. And that comes up a lot more often than you would think. That's the Chaos and Tribute package that I have for the main deck. So next up are some of the Tribute Fodder cards. I'm running 3 Gravekeeper Spy. You could run simply 2 Gravekeeper Spy, or if you wanted, you could try 3 Gravekeeper Spy and 1 Guard, but I personally prefer to use 3 Gravekeeper Spy because sometimes 1 Spy gets killed, or you can reuse a Spy with Book of Moon and end up summoning that 3rd one, because I definitely have had situations where I had 2 Spies in my first hand, and then I have to search up the 3rd one. And then, even then, 2000 defense wall isn't a bad card to have. Even in the fail case scenario where you end up having extra Gravekeeper Spies in the deck. Then I'm running 2 Apprentice Magician. I've been kind of going back and forth between 3 Apprentice Magician, but I end up drawing multiples of it too often for my liking. And while it can be nice for the same reasons drawing multiples of Gravekeeper Spy, you know, Gravekeeper Spy, as I mentioned, is a good wall, but Apprentice Magician isn't a great wall on its own, so it's kind of iffy. It does, however, combo with some cards, but for targets for the Apprentice Magician, we're running 2 copies of Magician of Faith, which a lot of people say that you could run 3 copies, or you should run 3 copies of Magician of Faith, but I personally don't like to have it where if my Magician of Faith gets knocked, either my own Magician of Faith that I, have set, or my opponent's Magician of Faith gets hit with my own knock, and then I have to banish all 3 copies from the deck. I don't like to have no more targets left for Apprentice Magician, and also lose out on so many lights in the deck. So this is where the tech card Time Wizard comes into the deck, because I sort of got a tip from MMF indirectly about this card, because it was mentioned that it was an apprentice target because it is a level 2 spellcaster, and also it is a light attribute, and 500, 400, so it is searchable by Apprentice Magician, and it's another light in case your Magician of Faith gets knocked, and it has some very interesting interactions, because Time Wizard, as most people know, it is a field nuke card, but it is a flip whether or not it activates to destroy your opponent's or your side of the field. I've played this and I've been very lucky with it to almost always get the correct call, but I have at least 4 times called it incorrectly. But the thing is, you only will try to activate its effect when either you absolutely have to, or when it doesn't matter if your own field gets nuked. Because there's a scenario where you summon Time Wizard because you want it to die so that you have the attributes for Blackluster Soldier or Chaos Sorcerer in the grave. And then even if you call it wrong, rather, you end up having a positive in that scenario. Of course, that's like the best possible outcome, but it has come up more than once where I wanted to do that. And then if you get it correct, you're still nuking the opponent's field, so you don't feel bad about not having it correct in that case. Apprentice Magician also combos with the one Breaker the Magical Warrior in the deck, which we play because, of course, it's a dark. It combos with the Apprentice Magician to put a new spell counter on it so it can activate its effect again. But also it's good to have Breaker because it's a decent beat stick when you need it, and of course it's spell trap removal, which is good for making way for our Chaos Monsters and our Tributes. It's important in these kinds of decks to have more aggressive cards than just your Tributes, so that if you're top decking, you can still pressure the opponent. And in those early turns, it's sometimes very important to pressure an opponent who's also on the control aspect of the game. That's also why I opted, instead of the third Apprentice Magician lately, to play one copy of GD Warrior Lady, because it is a good target for Sangan, which this deck was kind of missing for a while, because basically you can only search for Gravekeeper Spy, Apprentice, and while Magician of Faith and Time Wizard can sometimes be really great, they're also not very aggressive plays, and sometimes you have to be able to go on the offensive. Time Wizard more so does work for that, but it also, of course, is a flip whether or not it'll work. But sometimes you do just go for Faith or Gravekeeper Spy. But having DD Warrior Lady in the deck to attack over opponents' monsters that are bigger or put pressure on their life points is pretty important in my opinion. Plus, of course, it is a light attribute, even though it's kind of like a half light because it likes to banish itself a lot. Then we also have Tribe Infecting Virus, good for making use of the Thunder Dragons or dumping stuff like our Jinzo or Blowback Dragon to revive later, or to put in attributes for Blackluster Soldier and Chaos. And plus, just generally a pretty decent card. And of course, the one Sangan. Our deck is relatively light on tribute monsters, so I opted for just 3 of these steal effects, or I guess technically 4 because of Snatch Steal, but Snatch Steal is just overall a good card. Brain Control I play 2 of, and I play 1 Soul Exchange. For a while I was playing 2 and 2, but I found out, and I also got advice from Alephia on this, that Brain Control and Soul Exchange are often dead when I don't have something to tribute, and because this deck is light on tributes especially, that happens very often. Brain Control, at least you can still steal the opponent's monster and possibly turn around the game completely, like double crashing their monsters so they lose 2 of them, or stealing their Kaiku to remove their attributes from the graveyard, or stealing the opponent's Tribe Infecting Virus to clear the field and then kill itself afterward. But Soul Exchange is more of a niche card, but it's good to have the 1 copy of Soul Exchange because it allows you to even steal face down monsters or tribute face down monsters for your effects, even if you lose that on your battle phase. And that comes up a lot. And plus, you don't have to pay life points for Brain Control, which comes up very, very, very often because this is a more slower and control-y type deck. Even with the Chaos Monsters, you end up getting low life points a lot. Also because you're trying to play the advantage game more than the life point game until you can finally out-advantage them and just finish them off. And there are so many times where you end up with like 800, 500 life points left, and then you can't use your Brain Control anymore. So that's another reason why Soul Exchange is good. And then again, Snatch Steal, just overall good. And it's kind of like playing a third Brain Control in a way, but better. Then we have 2 copies of Book of Moon in this deck. I can't abuse it as much as some decks can, Really, I can only abuse it with Magician of Faith and Gridkeeper Spy, and sometimes I can use it to flip Apprentice to make a counter on Breaker, which is something I've done twice before. But the other good reason to have it is to just generally act sort of as removal, and to protect your Chaos Monsters and your Blowback Dragons, especially from the opponent's Snatch Steals and their own brain controls and Chaos Sorcerers and stuff like that, because these guys are huge magnets for stealing effects, and when they do get stolen, it's usually a blowout for you. So that's why it's good. Again, this is advice I got from Alethea, to have 2 Book of Moon in the deck. 3 of them main decked feels kind of overkill, and because you can't really abuse them, but I do have another one sighted for when we take out a bunch of our traps, which of course we're running a low trap count because we are using Jinzo. Then of course I have the obvious cards, the Trinity and Heavy Storm, Mystical Space Typhoon, 2 Noblemen Crossout, and I have a Premature Burial, which again is better in this deck than it is in most control decks because I do have the Blowback Dragons and Jinzo, which essentially get value when you revive them with Premature Burial. Not technically value with Jinzo because it doesn't give you a plus, but you could potentially plus off of reviving Blowback Dragon, which you don't from reviving something like a Zaborg. And also something you could do, which is fun, is to summon Breaker, the Magical Warrior, with Premature Burial or Call the Haunted, and then summon an Apprentice Magician, or vice versa, to put a counter on it. I've only done that once, surprisingly, but it was fun, and it's just an interaction to keep in mind with the deck. And also, you can revive your Time Wizard to potentially nuke the field, and if you fail, then essentially you took 1,050 damage to flip a coin to destroy the opponent's cards. Then, of course, I mentioned the Call the Haunted. We run the staples of Mirror Force, Torrential, and Ring. And then we have 1 copy of Raigeki Break in the deck to make use of the Thunder Dragons, to set up attributes, to unbrick our hands, and then revive our cards with Premature Burial and Call the Haunted. And generally to be an all-around removal card, because sometimes you just really have to get rid of something like Thousand Eyes Restrict, or an opponent's BLS, or Kaiku on the opponent's field, things like that. Finally, I will finish up with some side cards that I use for this deck, but there are a lot that you could consider. I kind of went pretty spicy with this, but what I decided on was to side deck a Dark Dust Spirit, which is a level 6 zombie with 2200, 1800, can't be special summoned, and during the end phase, normal summoned or flip face up, return to the hand, and when it is normal summoned or flip face up, you destroy all other face up monsters on the field. It's essentially a lightning vortex. I play it especially against decks that use Thousand Eyes Restrict, because it will not only destroy the opponent's goat tokens and their Thousand Eyes Restrict, but then it will return itself to the hand so they can't then snatch it with their Snatch Steal or Thousand Eyes Restrict the following turn. And it's good against decks that like to swarm the field. And one combo you can do with it after it nukes the field and attacks the opponent directly is you can then hit it with Book of Moon to put it face down so that you can end up using the effect again. Either when the opponent ends up attacking into it or on your next turn when you flip summon it. So it's pretty fun to use and a card that I think should be explored more. The downside is, of course, that it's Earth attribute in this deck, but I like to use it. Another tech card that I like to have in the side deck is the End of Anubis, level 6 Dark Fiend with 2500 and 0, and while this card is face up on the field, all effects of spell, trap, and monsters that target a card in the graveyard or that activate in the graveyard are negated. So the reason that you would have this in, you would side this in, is if the opponent has some really decent beat sticks like Monarchs, and the 2500 is going to become relevant, or against a deck that is running a lot of Recruiters, and it also will be able to stop opposing Magician of Faith, and sometimes it could be relevant against an empty jar deck if they're trying to bring back a Cyber Jar, but the problem is that usually that means that they already killed End of Anubis, but sometimes you can kind of cheese it out with like Call the Haunted when they try to do that. But just a fun card that you don't see a lot, but sometimes it can be really good against the opponent's cards. It does, of course, have anti-synergy with our own Magician of Faith and with our 2 revival cards, but that's only 4 cards in our deck versus hopefully 6+ in our opponent's decks, because it actually does not stop Apprentice Magician in GOAT format, because Apprentice Magician is considered to activate on the field. Something like 1 month after GOAT format, End of Anubis does negate Apprentice Magician, but specifically in GOAT format, it does not. So that's an interesting interaction again. And then if we already have End of Anubis on the field and our Apprentice Magician gets activated, we get to summon Time Wizard instead of Magician, because our Magician probably isn't going to get to activate. And that's another reason why, if you're playing a more fun version of this deck like I am, that you don't want to play 3 Magician of Faith, so you can run that tech End of Anubis. Then I also have 1 Mobius. Good to have back row removal as well. It is useful when you're playing against decks that are very stally, like they have Gravity Bind, etc., or Level Limit Area B. Then we have 1 copy of Kaiku for against Chaos decks, Return decks, Reasoning Gate decks. Then we have Neko Mane King, or Neko Main King, however it's supposed to be pronounced. Basically, just have it against the alt-win decks that it works against. An extra copy of Book of Moon and 1 copy of Enemy Controller for when we are running Royal Decrees, which we have 3 of. Usually when I put in the Royal Decrees, I take out Call the Haunted, Turn to a Tribute, Ring, and Raigeki Break, and then we move around some of these other things, and I either put in Book of Moon or Enemy Controller or both. Then we have 1 extra copy of Soul Exchange for when you're playing against flip heavy decks. You could either take out a Brain Control or another card to put in another Soul Exchange. You would also put in another Soul Exchange if you end up, for instance, putting in all 3 of these Tribute Monsters for whatever reason. Then I have 3 copies of Curse Seal Forbidden Spell, because we're running a bunch of spell cards and we can run even more of them. Good against alt-win decks and Reasoning Gate decks. 1 copy of Dust Tornado, basically good for against stall decks again. You could take out this Dust Tornado for something else, considering we have Mobius and Jinzo and Heavy Storm and Visible Space Typhoon, but I like to have it just in case. And that rounds out the deck profile. Let me know what you guys think about the deck, if there's any changes that you would personally make for your own version of the deck, as well if you have any ideas for other decks that you'd like to see, or anything GOAT format related at all that you'd like to see me make a video about. Thank you very much and have a good one.